Welcome to Chris Parkin Shooting Sports. A lot of you comment and seem to very much enjoy my sort of workshoppy videos where I'm not only putting together rifles I need to use, but I'm also explaining some of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing. Well, for those of you who've been keeping track of the sort of pushing the distances series using this CZ457 stainless synthetic, you'll have noticed that on the latest video I got out to 300 meters, but I then ran out of travel on this Element Helix HDLR scope. Now, that is no criticism of the scope at all. This scope offers approximately 30 milliradians of adjustment, but I was actually running out of adjustment just under 14 milliradians. So the point is, somewhere we've got a lot of adjustment in there that we're not actually actively using. So you might be thinking, where are all those spare milliradians, where are they being used? Well, they're actually being used zeroing the scope. So if I actually dial this scope, it's got a zero stop on it, and this is zeroed at 50 meters. Now some people say, why don't you zero it at longer range? Well, actually, zeroing it at longer range doesn't really make any difference because you're still using the actual fixed mechanical travel within that scope, which effectively is moving the erector tube up and down like that, and it's got a limit to it. Now, if I look at where it's zeroed, so I'm zeroed at zero stop there, I can go up one rotation, which is 6 milliradians, two rotations, which is 12 milliradians, 13, and I can't quite get to 14 milliradians. But here is where those are being used. Because if I take this cap off here, you can see underneath we've got the zero stop set up, and if I just slacken this off so that I can effectively dial the scope down to a lower distance, or so you might think. I go clockwise now. Well, I've already used 6, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 20 and a half milliradians there, which aren't being used. So we dial that back to 0 point, and we've now of course back to counting clicks. Now I know I was just under 14 from top end adjustment, so if I go to there, I've got one rotation, two rotations, and that's back to where my zero stop was originally set up. And that is the whole point of having a zero stop, that you don't have to count your rotations or count your clicks or count your adjustment from where you were set up at. So I'm going to leave that loose for the moment now because I don't want to be using the zero stop because I'm swapping my scope mounts. I'll just leave that marked at 0 there so I know roughly where I was. So you could say put an inclined Picatinny rail on it, and that's a very, very common option. Something like this 457 LRP already features a 25 MOA Picatinny rail on it. I've also got adjustable rings on it because that allows me to add even more elevation. But the point is, the adjustable rings, they're not sort of in fixed increments of 0 or 10 or 20 or 30 MOA. They're actually totally tunable. Now I'm going to be setting this scope up with the FX No Limit scope rings. They've got a standard airgun or rim-fired dovetail, which is 9 to 11 millimeters. Now, I probably wouldn't use a ring like this on a super recoil rifle, but something like an airgun or a rimfire, you've not got a huge amount of recoil. It's more down to just being careful with your mechanical handling of the gun. You don't bash it and bump it around. And as well as these in the dovetail setting here, you can also have those in a Picatinny setup, which is what I've used on there. And you can clearly see the inclination on there because the rear ring has been jacked up and the front ring is down all the way at the bottom of its travel to make sure we're getting the most inclination on the scope. Because essentially what we want to do now is we want to take that scope and we want to tip it down like that, tip it looking down, so that the gun is effectively like you saw me do then. You tip the scope down, you tip the barrel up, don't you? Effectively, and that's giving you the longer range potential. But being that this is a 2.2 rimfire that I want to use for hunting as well as shooting at longer distances, I still want to maintain a 50 meter zero or 50 yard zero, whatever you prefer, because it's all very well putting, you know, huge amounts of inclination into a setup for shooting extreme distance, but you can't then dial back to shorter distances. So you have to think about what you want your shortest distance to be, and I want my shortest distance to be 50 meters. So I'm going to remove these rings and I'm going to put the FX rings on in their place. So you'll have to just bear with me, and I'll try and talk to camera while I'm doing this because I'm going to do it real time. And then after I've put them on, I'm going to show you a little bit about adjusting them, and then I'm also going to show you when I get to the range a little bit later on, how we can tune them to give them exactly what we want. Because, for example, say I want that scope, it's got 30 milliradians, whatever it's got on it. You know, your scope is your scope. I want to leave a little bit of spare at either end because I don't really want to be jamming it against the internal tube surfaces. There's also the fact you've got two-dimensional movement within that tube, the erector tube going around. So if you bump it all the way across windage, well, you're always going to lose a little bit of elevation. So you have to bear in mind, you don't really want to be pushing things to the extremes. So I'll just pop these back together. And now we can take these off the gun, because we're not going to use those now. Now it's important to remember that when you're talking about angles and distances, it gets back down to a bit of kind of boring geometry. And depending on how far apart you space these rings, it will alter the amount of inclination they can offer. Now, on the instruction book that comes with the FX rings, it does actually say, let's have a little look here. Okay, solves a huge problem of all air rifle weapons enthusiasts. Well, I'm using it on a rim-5, but not too far apart. Keep the optical centre and tilt lens easily with only one screw. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but essentially that's how they're advertising it. No more problems zeroing your optics. Well, there can be other problems, so let's not, completely say these are the magical solution to everything. Adjustable approximately 4 millimeters vertically, equal to 4 meters in height range at 100 meters. So here's where we start talking about the interesting factors, because if you look at these rings, that top lifts up and down, and that's your 4 millimeters there, and essentially it also tips backwards and forwards, because don't forget, when you move these up and down, you also need to make sure that they're tilting so that they align with each other. And the other factor to remember is that depending on how far apart they actually are on the rifle will affect how far they give you in added inclination. So if I just nip these in position here. So if they're that far apart, you can put the rear ring all the way up and the front ring all the way down, and you get that much inclination, and you'll tilt them slightly so that they line up. But of course, if that ring is further forward, sometimes it looks a bit artificial there, but if you imagine it like that, all the way up and all the way down, well actually you're going to be adding even more inclination doing that. Depending on exactly how far apart the rings are to space them around the saddle and get your eye relief and things, it will slightly affect the extreme amount of elevation you can add. But we can tune this, because what I want to do is I want to set this up from all the way at one end with about a milliradian on it, do my zero at 50 meters, and then I can see how much of that I can then dial all the way through, because theoretically I should have the whole rest of the travel. Now when I actually count the clicks and rotations on it, it does actually have slightly more than 30 milliradians. So say I get this set up with 2 milliradians used from the actual top end, I've then got 31 milliradians to dial down for longer range. 13.3 I think off the top of my head was the requirement I needed to shoot 300 meters, but this is going to let me dial a lot further. So taking these apart, I'll probably speed this up. Now the FX rings do come with their own Allen keys for setting them up, but I'm just using my ones in the workshop just because they're a little bit easier to handle, speed things up a little bit on camera. But essentially these are going to go in here like this now. I'm going to leave a little bit of space between the saddle and the front ring, and I'll do the same at the back end, because I just prefer to have a little bit of freedom of movement. But I know that the eye relief will still be the same, because that's what I used on the previous set of rings. Now if you've not done this before and you are completely going into these rings the first time, you just set them up as normal and you'll set up your eye relief as normal. But essentially my eye relief is being controlled on this rifle by the position of that rear scope ring. So I'm just going to tighten those up about 3 Newton meters. Now if I show you, look, can you see this scope will now tip up and down like that, and I can put the front ring all the way down, the rear ring all the way up, and those aren't tightened up yet, but look now how much elevation we are adding, and you can see that that scope is actually balancing on that rear ring, and it will actually tilt down there like that. But essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be tilting the rings toward each other so that there's no stress or strain in the actual whole setup. once it's finished. Now that is where you've got to be a little bit savvy mechanically, because you've got to be patient with it and careful with it, and make sure you don't tighten one axis up all the way on its own before you've kind of aligned and snugged up a couple of the others, because as you tighten each one, things will move a little bit, and the whole point is we want this all put together without any strain on it. So I'll just put these rings on just so that they're not rolling around on the workbench. I'm just going to make sure the actual elevation of the ring is controlled by that single screw there. There are two screws here which control the spacing on the dovetail, and then that is what controls the elevation. So you can see there that that is at the moment loose, so it will move like that. But I don't want to tighten anything down until I've got an approximate position. And if I'm tilting the front all the way down and the rear all the way up, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start gently nipping up these scope rings, starting with the front one to make sure everything stays or starts to gain position. Because if you just put it together and just tighten it all up, yes, everything will bend into place, but because, you know, these are a lot stronger than anything else, but you don't want it like that because you're actually distorting the tube itself. Now I'm going to make sure everything's loose on that axis there, and it doesn't hurt to just have a play about with these on your workbench or in your kitchen or wherever you set your rifle up, and just nip those in position. We're not bothering about alignment yet on the reticle or anything like that, because what I want to do primarily is get the rings aligned with each other. Now the rings are aligned with each other now, so if I lift that scope up and down, you can see them moving in unison, and you can see the back one moves a lot, the front one moves a little because it's aligning with the rear one. But of course, rotationally speaking, with the scope that way for the reticle, we're not worrying about that yet, because I want to get that sorted out first. Now once I've got this sorted out, that is when I'm going to move and go zero the rifle. I'll do that and bring that film back and add on to this a little bit later on, because we might make a few tweaks while we're out zeroing. But essentially, if I decide that that is correct there, and that's maximum elevation possible, and I've got these ring tops here tightened down on the tube, that makes sure the rings are aligned, and I can now tighten down the base of the ring itself to make sure that axis is locked in position. But you're perhaps understanding why you don't just want to tighten one and then do the other without thinking about the sequence in which you're doing it. Now at the moment that scope's not zeroed and that reticle's not aligned vertically. But what I want to do is I'll align the reticle vertically now, because I can now slacken these off, and I know that the rings are aligned correctly in a linear fashion. So I can go down, line up the scope by whichever way I prefer to use, tighten it back down, and that's all going to stay in position. Now when I get to the range, I'm going to zero this, but I might then find out I've put too much elevation on and I can't zero at 50 meters. So what I'll then do is I'll tweak this a little bit, slacken it off, slacken these off, take a little bit of the elevation out of the system, i.e. remove that gap there. It's about 4 millimeters at the moment. I could drop that down to 3 millimeters or 2 millimeters, and it's a case of doing this and learning what you're doing. But once it's all done, once it's all tightened in place, you can take the scope off and it won't be a problem putting it back on. Of course, on the Picatinny rings, like on this 457 LRP here, it's much easier to do, and this one's set up because this one will still shoot extreme distance out to 500 plus meters, but it will also go back down to 50 meters because I use this one for a little bit of PRS plinking fun. That's also a 34mm tube, which gives more physical space within the tube for the actual erector tube inside it to move up and down. But you don't necessarily get a brighter image from a 34mm tube, you just get more mechanical travel. Right, let's go to the range. Right, I'm at the range now, so I'm going to zero this rifle. Now, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just bore sight it. I've got a target out at 50 metres. And if I look at bore sighting that now, it needs, thankfully, a lot of elevation taking off because we've put that in via the scope mounts. Right, it's approximately bore sighted now, so let's have a shot. Okay, so we're still hitting a little bit high. So essentially what I want to do is I want to zero this now with some elevation wound onto it. And I'm going to go for 2 mils just because I want that room for actual manoeuvre in terms of if I change ammunition, and I don't want to be having to slacken off the mounts or anything like that when I'm using the scope. Again, just slacken off the rear ring screws, which allows me to alter spacing slightly. Now, it only needs the tiniest amount of movement on these spacers to make quite an effect at target. And of course, the further away you are from the target, the more difference it will make. If you don't have any feeler gauges, it's possible you could use Allen keys themselves, which usually come in 0.5 millimetre size increments, and put them between the top and the bottom of the scope ring to help you gauge how much it's moving each time. But I'm doing it without any tools really, just trial and error. Right, I'm too low down now. I've moved them down a little bit too far. Now I could, if I wanted to, dial that up to zero it easily now. We're looking on that, that's about 2 mils low still. Dial another mil on there, another 2 mils on there, and that should come about level with the red spot now. So at 50 metres we were aiming on the red spot in the centre. The first group was up there way high, so we adjusted the mounts to take some of the elevation off, and then we moved back down there, and then we shot the group here just to the right, which is okay for elevation, and then we moved the windage a little bit and shot the better group there for correct windage. But I think that's a little bit too high still, and I do want this to be absolute precision, so I'm going to tweak the mounts a little bit more now. I'm going to dial on perhaps 2 mils of elevation and re-zero the scope mount, so I've got that room for... So this is the point, you've got to tweak it backwards and forwards just to get that perfect space. Now I think we should be about there now. I'm going to shoot down the right hand side of the red spot so I can see a new group. So yeah, if you see that, we're just a little bit low. We are about 3/4 of a mil low. I'm actually going to aim at that bullet. Oh, and there we go. So we're now zeroed. I'm going to put a few shots on the steel. Headshot on the rabbit. I think it's still just a tiny little bit low. Chest shot on the rabbit. Aiming at the head again. So we've still got a little bit of vertical dispersion. But we can now tweak that within individual clicks. So all I need to do now is take this cap off and set my zero stop. So I rotate that collar all the way clockwise, and nip up the 2 little grub screws. Now, although I like using the zero stop, I tend to leave a bit of spare play in it. So if I move it all the way clockwise, that will do me the zero stop. If I move it back there, that's going to give me about 5 or 6 clicks. So I can't overrun my zero stop by more than I can easily see on the dial itself when I put the cap back on the turret. Put that back on there now, indicating 0. So I can now move up 1, 2, 3 clicks. And I can now move down for longer range 1 rotation, which is 6 milliradians. 2 rotations, 12. 3 rotations, 18. 4 rotations, 24. 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 32.1 milliradians is available now for me to shoot longer range. Dial all the way back down to the zero stop, it'll drop about 3 clicks below 0. Click, 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 and that's back at 0 now. Right, I've moved from 50 metres back to 100 metres, and I know my drop at 100 metres should be 2.1 mils. So we dial on 2.1 mils there, and let's have a go on some steel. Now bear in mind, a 50 metre zero isn't technically quite as refined as a 100 metre zero, but you've got to balance it out against, you know, the conditions. And if it's very, very windy, especially with vertical dispersion, zeros based in those conditions aren't necessarily great. So maybe it's good to go for a slightly shorter zero that's more precise in terms of conditions than the longer zero, which is more at risk from wind dispersion. So we've got a bit of a right to left wind going on. So I'm just aiming on the right edge of the disc. And we're getting strikes just left of centre. So that, again, that's exactly what I've just said. The wind is having slightly more of an effect. But in terms of elevation, I'm reasonably happy with that. And the point of today's exercise was to set the scope mounts up. So we were really close to where we needed to be. And we're within a click or two of perfect zero at the moment. The windage I can, of course, do at a later date when those conditions are slightly more favourable. So if we look at the app now, which I set up a ballpark ballistic solution on, zeroed at 50 metres still, if we look here, we've now got over 400 metres of potential dialing distance. And of course I can now easily dial within that range. And 400 metres is further than I've shot this rifle so far. It's my next goal to see if I can shoot when the weather's right, and we'll give that a go sometime soon. Now, I never was and never will be a school maths teacher, but I have been trying to think of the easiest way of explaining this to you, how this system actually works. Because if we look here now, this way up, you can see that now I've got this zero, and that is the gap I've got in the front and the rear ring. Now the front ring essentially is locked all the way down. Now I did mention you could use something like feeler gauges or something like that if you want to set this precisely. But actually, if you've got a set of Allen keys, you've got a rough sort of 1/2 mil increments, and you can pop those in there and you can roughly see exactly what that spacing is. And if you're making very minor movements to it, you can actually use that once these are slackened off just to very, very carefully ease that gap open just a tiny little bit. If you want to add a little bit more elevation, conversely the other way around, you do just have to slacken it a bit more and just squeeze it down. So it's easy to push them apart than to push them together. So that's one way of doing it. Now you can see the gap here on the rings I've got, and I'm going to try and show you a way to sort of work out how you're getting this distance set up. Now if you imagine that your scope rings, and this one they're just over 100mm apart, but let's stick with some standard numbers. So let's, imagine they were 100mm apart, that is 95mm apart, but just imagine they were 5mm further apart and you had a gap of 4mm in the rear ring. Or let's just say there were 3mm in the rear ring. So you've effectively got a triangle. It's all about angular changes. It's not about vertical movement, it's about angles. So say that's your baseline, and then that's the line your scope is on, and then this is the gap here, okay, that you've got between the bottom and the top of the ring, and you're moving this up and down to get it what you want. So say that gap is 4mm and your rings are 100mm apart. So if you just start adding zeros to this, it'll scale out to distance. So you add 1, 2, 3 zeros to that, 1, 2, 3 zeros to that, and instead of being 4mm, that's now 4 meters, 4,000mm. Instead of that being 100mm, that's now 100,000mm, which is 100 meters. So you're from 4mm and 100mm to 4 meters and 100 meters. So essentially that will give you a maximum adjustment of 4 meters at 100 meters. Now at 100 meters, 1 milliradian is 10 centimeters. So 10 milliradians is a meter. And if we've gone 4 meters from 1 meter, you can call that 40 milliradians. And the scope starts out with an internal mechanical adjustment of just over 30 milliradians. So it gives you an idea of the relative value that those rings will give you compared to what the scope can adjust on its own. Now of course, once you've set it up and locked it all down, you leave it set up and locked down. But I've just come back now from shooting with this thing, and I thought, what's the best way to kind of demonstrate to you guys? So effectively, if you've got a 0 gap at the front and a 2mm gap at the rear, or a 3mm gap at the rear, or a 4mm gap at the rear, that equates to 20, 30 or 40 milliradians that you're able to add. Now as we said before, don't go for too much so that you can't actually zero at the closer distances you want to zero at, and that's why I set it up at 50 meters, because that's as close to zero as I want. But I can now shoot to well over 400 meters with this scope without losing my 50 meter zero, all on the adjustment dial without changing anything mechanical. Right, well I hope you enjoyed watching that review, and it's given you a little bit of an idea on setting up these FX adjustable height scope rings to give you more elevation and longer range capability from an air rifle or a rimfire. These rings are available in Picatinny as well, and I've used those on some of the rifles which are suitable for that. But of course you've seen the fact that I can optimise my zero distance to make sure I'm getting the most of my mechanical travel from the scope, whatever's in there internally available from the turret itself. Well, please like, subscribe, comment, and don't forget to click the notification bell to keep track of the regular uploads. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.